How can picturing death help us understand the gospel? Let's explore that in this week's Abide. Hi, I'm Stephen, and this week's Abide comes from the passage in the Our Daily Bread devotional for Monday, the 22nd of July. Sometimes when I read a Bible passage, I try and picture the place where it's happening. So when I read of Jesus speaking with the woman at the well, I think of a well in a dry, sandy place. Or I think of a beach when I read of Jonah being thrown up by the big fish. Picturing these places in my mind helps me to dive into the passage and helps bring it to life. And I found the same thing helps even when a passage doesn't actually describe a geographical place. In today's passage, Paul doesn't necessarily describe a physical location, but he does use language in a certain way to help us grasp the truth of what he's saying. And I found it still possible to picture places in our mind that can help us grasp what he's saying and apply these words to our hearts. So friends, let's try reading through this passage together. And we'll pause each time Paul uses words that might help us picture what he's saying. There are three phrases that we'll focus on. For context, we'll start with a few words from verse 1 of Ephesians chapter 2. Paul writes, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." The words, "you were dead," are rather strong, aren't they? They're not words we might like to dwell on. They probably don't conjure up many nice images in our minds, but dwelling on these words and picturing them in our minds will help us grasp what Paul is getting at. So let me read them again. "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." What does come to your mind? Perhaps you picture a grave. I used to live in a house that backed directly onto a graveyard. There were graves just a couple of meters from the house. I'm picturing that graveyard. I'm picturing a body that's lifeless, still, cold. You might even think of a biblical image. My mind wanders to Lazarus in the tomb in John chapter 12. His body is just lying there, doing nothing. What's coming to your mind? As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. Let's now move on to verse 4. Paul writes, "But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions." Paul says that God, in his great love for us, made us alive. He brought us back from the dead. Dwell on those words. Made us alive. Again, what comes to your mind? I'm picturing a garden coming to life with the arrival of spring. It may not be cold wherever you are in Australia, but here in Melbourne at the moment, it's pretty cold. When I picture the words "made us alive," I'm imagining all the trees and plants and wildlife that will burst into life come spring. What are you picturing? My mind also wanders to Lazarus again. For 4 days his body lay lifeless, dead in the tomb. But suddenly Jesus speaks and Lazarus is raised from the dead. As it says in John 12 verse 44, the dead man came out. So Paul's spoken of death and now life, and next he takes us even further. Friends, let me read verse 6 for us. "And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus." Let's focus on that phrase, seated us with him in the heavenly realms. What do you picture in your mind? When you picture heaven, what do you think of? I'm imagining sitting alongside Jesus, being with him in his presence. I'm picturing how different it is to this broken world, how much better, how much sweeter it is to be with him. I'm imagining scenes of joy and laughter and love. What comes to your mind? Seated us with him in the heavenly realms. The thing is, Paul says we are seated with Christ right now. This isn't just a future promise, but a present reality. What difference might it make to our current lives if we spent time pondering this reality that somehow you and I are currently sitting alongside Jesus Christ in the heavenly realms? I can't say I understand how, but I know it strengthens me as I think of it. Picturing the images these ideas bring to mind may help us reflect on these staggering truths. Paul's taken us from the grave to the heavens. These three descriptions, dead in our sin, made alive in Christ, and seated in Christ, capture the essence of the gospel. We were dead in sin and we couldn't do anything about it. A dead person cannot raise themselves to life. But God did bring us to life in Christ. Like Lazarus, God raised us from death in sin to salvation life in Christ. And he's seated us with him in the heavenly realms. So picture that grave. If you know Christ, you are no longer there in sin. And even though we will all end our life on earth in one, it will not hold us. Picture what came to mind when we dwelt on those words, made us alive. This is what God has done. He's brought us to life. And picture that truth of being seated with Christ right now in the heavenly realms. What encouragement does that give you today? If you want to know when each new episode of Abide is released, you can subscribe to our channel and maybe let us know in the comments what encouragement this brought you today. And if you want to read or listen to this episode, you can do so through the links in the description. We'll see you next week.